So good evening. Good evening. We're gonna have to try that again. Almost got there. Last week was really impressive for those of you who were here, but we'll give this another try. Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to the final program in the 2024 Winter Lecture Series. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you to all the familiar faces that we've seen throughout March and February, and those faces that we see year after year. The library partners with Gritstone Viaduct Historical Education Society. I got it right the other night without even thinking, and then when I'm in front of a crowd, I messed it up. But we partner with the Gritstone Viaduct every year to bring you these programs. But we couldn't do it without all of your support and your attendance. So thank you. Please come back next year. I expect all the familiar faces to be here and hopefully some of the unfamiliar faces as well. Please come back. We'll be working on the 2025 schedule in the months to come, and look for a brochure somewhere around January next year. These programs, as most of you know, for the last 3 years have been live streamed. So if you can't make it to any of our programs, you can always watch them live online or go back and watch one of the recordings of the broadcasts after the fact. They're on our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and our library website. And all of our upcoming programs in 2025 will be the same. So if you're not in the area, you can't make it to the program, know next year that you can always watch those online. For those of you who are new to the library, the bathrooms take a left, and then a left for the men, a right for the women. That's where our bathrooms are. And then, last but not least, I'm guilty of this, but please silence your cell phones now out of respect for our speaker tonight. Our speaker, Taylor Abbott, is here with us again. He was here with us last year. Some of you may remember him speaking about the Scioto disaster. I even looked that up online. I'm not from this area, if you can't tell from my Wisconsin accent. Tonight he'll be presenting a River Runs Through It early exploration. So those of you who wait for my pun every week, does anybody know why early explorers were so invested in exploring the Ohio River? Because they heard it had banks on both sides. It's the best I can do. I'm sorry. I know it's the last in the series, but yeah. Okay, so moving along, or rolling down the river. Our guest tonight, Taylor Abbott, is a historian, writer, and the treasurer of Monroe County, Ohio. For more than 200 years, his family has been connected with the Ohio River. His ancestors built, owned, and piloted. It's been a long. They piloted steamboats on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. During the past 14 years, Taylor has presented and lectured at various audiences and organizations, and he serves on the board of directors of the Sons and Daughters of Pioneer Rivermen. He's also an advisor to various museums and historical projects. Taylor is a graduate of Ohio University and resides in Clarington, Ohio with his wife, where they live in a former church that they purchased in 2016 and renovated it into a home. Please welcome Taylor Abbott.
It's good to be back again. Thank you all. Thanks, Aaron, Dan, for the invite. I appreciate it. So, I feel that this is one of the topics that's really overlooked in this area. It's one of my favorites to present on because I think it's fascinating, and I think a lot of people don't realize just how much happened here before really the birds started to expand this region. So, I call it the early exploration of the Ohio Valley, and with that we start looking at the journeys that came down, the early settlements, the conflicts that happened, and also the westward expansion of the country, which really truly started here on the Upper Ohio River and expanded the rest of the country. But prior to Europeans coming, the early civilizations of the Ohio Valley were the mound builders, and these cultures were engaged in extensive trade networks. They exchanged goods like copper, mica, shells, and they did that over vast distances. It wasn't just right here locally. They expanded outward, up and down the river. Their societies were likely sedentary, which meant they focused on the ceremonial and ritualistic practices. And we see that around here, with the Adena culture, which is what the Great Creek Mound in Moundsville, which many of you have seen and looked at. I think it was 63,000 tons or something like that, the amount of dirt that was used to create that mound. But before the Europeans came in here, around 1000 BC to 500 CE, these two, Adena and Hopewell cultures, really were the first indigenous people that we really know that existed in this area. And for whatever reason, they started to disappear prior to Europeans coming, but we do find that these cultures existed. And today we see that in the burial mounds and the ornate effigy mounds that are throughout the state of Ohio and up along the river here. One of the things that led up to before the Europeans came, one of the factors that we can think of that potentially created the downfall of these early civilizations was probably disease or being pushed out by other indigenous peoples. It's really unknown at this point, but we do know once the Europeans started coming through the area, the vast majority of eastern Ohio, particularly along the Ohio River and into present-day West Virginia, it was largely uninhabited for about 100 years. The reason for that is unknown, but a lot of experts and people that read up on this and research it believe that it was mainly hunting grounds, but it was also, there was a fear factor in it. The Iroquois were a powerful Native American tribe, and they were based mainly in the north, up through New York, upper into Canada and that area. And a lot of times they would venture down into this region for the hunting that was here. And back then, you have to think, the wildlife then was a lot different than it is now. There were buffalo, there were elk, wolves, beaver, you name it, everything. Some of this still here, some of them aren't. But when they come down into this area, if they found any other tribes that were what they considered infringing, they would wipe them out pretty handedly and viciously. And that spread to these other smaller tribes that were in the region that were inferior. And it became pretty clear that the Iroquois were really ruthless in what they were doing and cleaning these people out and keeping them out of that, what they considered their hunting ground. So that begins with the Europeans when they start coming down the Ohio River. And the early explorations of the Ohio River were particularly between the French and the British. And the French were looking at this point for a connection to the south, and they were wanting to connect the Mississippi River and their territory in Canada and that upper region. They wanted to find a navigable connection through that region that could spur their trade that they were having with other Native Americans. And of course, when they were doing their fur trading, which was a very lucrative business at this time period. Territorial expansion, fur trade opportunities, and the desire to establish control over these valuable waterways was the main point of all of this. And that's when it became, it was a strategic area for them. This upper Ohio River led down to the Mississippi River, and that exploring and settling on that was very important to both the British and the French. So in 1669, we go to Robert Cavelier sur le Dessalles, and he was a French explorer, and he embarked on a journey from Montreal to Fort Niagara, and that's where he begins his exploration down into this region. But before that, he was in the Jesuit priesthood, which he eventually abandoned. He was teaching to students, but he realized that he had a lot more ambition than just wanting to teach Latin to these students and mathematics. So he decided he's going to seek better opportunity in the New World, which he did. He came over with other French colonists and expanded into North America. And this all culminated into his exploration and efforts to establish fur trading posts in the Mississippi River region. His primary goal was to find a navigable route to the Mississippi River, which could provide a trade and transportation route to the Gulf of Mexico. And that, again, that the territorial expansion is what they were looking for. They wanted control over this because it was such vast wealth. And when you're fighting and two people are competing over it, you're going to do what you can to gain control of this quickly. LaSalle didn't immediately discover a direct connection between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, however, during his expedition. Whether he actually found the Ohio River, we still aren't sure. I don't think that he found it on our end of the river. If he did connect with the Ohio River, I think it was much further down.
but there's still a great debate about this. I think it's likely he found the Ohio River, but there's still not solid evidence that he did come down this river. His aim was expanding French territorial claims and influence in the region. And despite not immediately doing this, LaSalle did play a crucial role in asserting French interests in the Ohio Valley. He quickly got a reputation when he was in Canada, and he decided he was going to get a group together to head south and explore the Mississippi River and the Ohio River. He got a real bad reputation early on as someone that was a bit of a dreamer, sort of, making himself out to be something he wasn't. He claimed that he could speak Iroquois. He claimed that he had interpreters that he knew along the way in these different tribes. And it didn't take too long before those in the group realized that they were in with somebody who was more of a charlatan than an actual explorer. So his journeys downriver were plagued by mishaps up and down. And finally, by the time he gets to the Gulf of Mexico and in that area, they've had enough. Some of these guys had enough with him. They weren't doing this anymore. So a gentleman that was in his group named Pierre Duhat ambushed him and killed him near Huntsville, Texas. That spelled the end of Robert Cavalier, Sieur de La Salle, and his legacy is that he didn't find what he was looking for, and he was more of someone that he wasn't in the end. So the French aren't done yet. In 1749, we see our friend here, Mr. Pierre Joseph Celeron, who was a French military officer. He was born in Canada. He played a crucial role in continuing that assertion of French territorial claims during the 18th century. And one of the things that he did was he led a significant expedition down the Ohio River with the mission of marking and reestablishing French claims. So this image here, you can see it pretty well. This is, I believe, inside the West Banco Arena. I'm a visual person. I know people don't want to just sit here and listen to me talk, so I try to make these visuals to show you. And these are always overdone. They're exaggerated. I'm sure nobody was dressed as well as they are in these photos, but this is Celeron at basically Wheeling Creek, establishing the French claim. Along the way, he buries what are called lead plates, and they're not very big. They're about the size of this microphone and a little bit wider. But these were buried along key locations, and they were inscribed with the French sovereignty that were more or less symbolic in an official act. And what they would do if he would get to a river, when they were coming down the Ohio River, if they, for example, when they landed here at Wheeling and they were at the mouth of Wheeling Creek, they would nail a cross onto a tree or a sign, and they'd bury the lead plate in the ground beneath it. Well, you can imagine if you're a Native American and you're seeing this person invading into your space, you're not going to take kindly to these symbols that are being nailed to the tree and they're burying it into the ground. So anytime these got planted, usually right behind them days later, Native Americans would come and strip it off the tree and maybe get a hold of these lead plates. So at this point, these in Wheeling, this is a replica of the one that was at Wheeling, or the one at Marietta, I'm sorry. But the one at Wheeling, there is a replica of it. It was never found. They believe it's buried somewhere, if it is still there, at the mouth of Wheeling Creek, probably under a parking lot or along the bank somewhere. But 200 plus years of erosion and silt. If it was ever found, it'd be probably one of the greatest finds in this valley's history, because it's very rare. In Marietta, there was a similar instance where this plate was buried at the mouth of the Muskingum. And, kids in 1798, there were a group of boys that were swimming along the riverbank on the Muskingum River, and they come across and they find this lead plate. Don't immediately tell their parents or anybody that they found this. So they start picking it apart and chipping at it. They're using it to make sinkers. They're using it to make lead balls. And then finally someone realized, hey, what are you guys playing with? What do you have there? And so most of the settlement in Marietta was the early settlers there were from New England. And unfortunately for us in our local history, this piece of history that was found was sent to Massachusetts, and it's sitting in the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. And after multiple requests, they still will not let it be loaned out to Campus Martius or the Ohio River Museum down at Marietta for display. So if anyone wants to see it, you'll have to go to Massachusetts. And if you find the one in Wheeling, do let me know. So leading up to this, these territorial claims continue. Celeron's expedition was part of this broader competition, again, with the French and the British for control of the territories. And it all leads up to what we know as the French and Indian War. It was a, it was a pivotal conflict here in the Ohio Valley, and this area and this region, it served as a crucial background, and it pitted the British against the French, with both nations vying for control of the region, and they also were trying to, get Native Americans that were in the region on their side as well. Fur trade was one of the things that was the biggest thing that they were trying to get control of. That's where the money was at this point, and that's what both countries were trying to take control of. So this area particularly was a strategic gateway for the American interior for the country. And the French were seeking that dominance while the British were trying to assert their own over the region. When they did that, these Native American alliances formed with tribes gaining support here in the Ohio Valley, and it led to conflicts and shifts in allegiances. So you had different Native American groups that were backing the French, and you had others that were backing the British in this, all leading up to a major battle. And there were, in this region, there were several key battles that occurred in the Ohio Valley, particularly at Fort Necessity, which is southeast of Pittsburgh, Braddock's expedition, and then, of course, the capture of Fort Duquesne. When this war happens, it does ultimately end in 1763. The British gain control at this point of the Ohio Valley, and at that point, it alters history. The balance of colonial power goes straight to the British at that point, and they're in control. The outcome pretty much laid the groundwork for colonial discontent here, not only in the east along the ocean and the lowlands, but here in this area, it contributed to the American Revolution because these British policies here in the Ohio Valley region fueled tensions between American colonies and the British government because naturally they're across the ocean and they're being dictated to. So the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and you see our old friend George III, King of the British Empire and of the colonies at that point. And he issues this proclamation, and he basically tells all of us colonists here in the U.S. that you're not going to be going past the Appalachian Mountains. He did not want anyone traversing past this because of Native American issues, and they didn't want to upset any fur trading at that point, and the somewhat peace that was there, but they knew this wasn't going to last because as Americans, we are inherently we don't like to be told what to do, and colonists were of no exception. They left Britain for a reason, and when they got here, they were still being controlled. So naturally, most of this proclamation was ignored by the colonists because they wanted to expand westward. They had heard what this region looked like. They knew exactly what they were after. They wanted more land. They wanted to expand and get away from this colonial control that was hanging over them. So as George III, his primary objective with this was to essentially establish a framework for newly acquired territories like Canada and Florida, and to basically mitigate any type of risk with these Native American tribes who had supported them during the war. So he wasn't only trying to protect British interests, he was trying to protect the Native Americans that supported the British during this war. So it tried to maintain peace. They were trying to prohibit the British colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. And it's at this point, the Ohio River, when you got to the border, when you got to Wheeling, or which was Virginia, in later years, if you got to the river, anything west of that on the Ohio side, you were basically off limits. You weren't supposed to go over there. So this obviously frustrated the colonists throughout the region and leading to considerable discontent. So this was all the buildup leading to what would become the American Revolution. So when you look at these pictures, we think of the Ohio Valley today when you're going up and down the river. You see trains, you see coal, you see factories, plants, and all that. But, prior to that, this region was absolutely an amazingly beautiful place. It was almost beyond belief for most of these Europeans to come to an area and see what we had here. But there also was a very significant danger in these hillsides and along the river, and it was the Native Americans. They, as we kept creeping in on them and into their territory, you had to know what you were doing. If you were a settler and you crossed the river into the Ohio side, you better be aware of your surroundings and know exactly what you're doing, because you're probably going to meet your fate in a very ugly way, and a very dangerous thing to do, especially to expand and go outward without anyone around you. It's just beyond. So the river itself posed the hazard. It was a natural flowing river. There were unpredictable currents, the floods that happened, and all sorts of navigational challenges. So those presented its own dangers. There were pirates and bandits on the river. So some of these settlers decided that they would take their chance and become, pirates of these people that were inexperienced coming down the river. So they would lure them in, they would lie to them, they would set them up, and then take what they had, and typically end up probably at some point selling those same goods that they stole back to those people. And of course, there were disease throughout, because these early settlers that came in here brought disease with them. So the Native Americans had their own challenges with us as settlers bringing disease to them, but they also had their logistical challenges of getting around. They were trying to navigate this area too as well, because it was their hunting ground. They're being infringed upon. So this whole area, while beautiful, it was a very wild and dangerous river, and a wilderness one at that. And if there's any questions along the way, please let me know. So in October 1770, George Washington, who's a young man at the time, before he was president and before he was commander of the Revolutionary Army, he is a scout. He's a surveyor, and his goal was to go down the river with his friend Colonel William Crawford. And we'll talk more about Colonel Crawford and his untimely demise. But it was a surveying expedition. He was leading a team of surveyors to assess and map land in the Ohio Valley, particularly in the region of present-day West Virginia. So this journey by Washington was of particular interest, because they were looking to acquire these western lands for him, both a personal investment, but also to promote settlement and development here in the valley. Washington's presence was also for a diplomatic reason. He was trying to, he was very good at defusing situations, but he was also respected among some of these tribes that were in the region. And French traders in the region, like ones that had been there earlier, he tried to make a cooperative and peaceful relations with them, so that these tensions and conflicts would be minimal, so that there wouldn't be any more wars. One of the things that he did do while he was in here, he promoted, when he was doing these surveys and reports, he really stimulated this interest in westward expansion and settlement. People started reading his notes or hearing about it, and they would get back. So this, obviously, when you're someone that maybe is in a crowded eastern city, or you want to get away and get your own land, and you hear these reports of this beautiful valley with expansive lands along the river bottom, fertile areas where you can farm, it's really going to entice you, and you're going to want to go there. And of course, people did. So this journey contributed to his experience as a frontier leader and as a landowner, and the role and broader history in the westward expansion of the country. He played a great deal in that. Probably the defining moment that really begins and sparks the major conflict. Off and on, you'd have Native Americans attacking settlers, settlers attacking Native Americans, but this singular incident, the Yellow Creek Massacre in April of 1774, really cemented itself and began what would become a lasting legacy of really brutal attacks on both sides. It was led predominantly in the beginning by Captain Michael Cressup near Wheeling. He recruited some backwoodsmen and basically on his own declared that he was declaring war on all Indians. And Yellow Creek, if you're familiar with it, as you can see on this map, this would be present-day Mountaineer Gaming Center in West Virginia. And this is where this is Yellow Creek emptying into the Ohio River. It's about 40 miles above Wheeling, which isn't far to us, but back then that was pretty significant. But over on the West Virginia side of the river, there was a tavern run by Mr. Baker who sold alcohol both to whites and Native Americans. And Native Americans had not been exposed to this before, alcohol, until we were here. But once they did, they have the same issues that we have now. You have alcoholism, you have people drinking too much, and that certainly happened back then, and it led to one of these conflicts. So these tensions rose due to murders between settlers and Indians. They were summoned to Fort Pitt. Settlers were summoned to Fort Pitt when they got word that this war by Michael Cressup had been declared, and they knew that there was going to be an impending Indian attack at some point, and there was going to be conflict. Leading up to this, a gentleman named Daniel Greathouse and 21 men decided they were going to attack and carry out an act. So they lure these Indians across the river on the other side to Baker Station, and the Greathouse Party is being friendly with them. They're chatting with them. They're playing games. They're doing, anything to keep everyone's guard down, more or less. So they're letting their guard down, and the drinks begin. So by the time that the Indians are drinking heavily, the Greathouse Party turns on them and kills a number of Native Americans on that side of the river, including family members of Chief Logan, who is pictured here in this photo. And Chief Logan was widely respected among in the region, especially among settlers, because he was peaceful up until this point. 2 canoes came across the river. You can see there when they hear the fight break out and they hear the gunshots and the screams of their relatives and friends, they come across the river to see what's happening. But when they get across, they're also ambushed. These Native Americans are sitting in their canoes. They're dead ducks. They're sitting ducks at that point because Greathouse and his party are just shooting them like fish in a barrel. And this would basically become the starting point for the Lord Dunmore's War. So after the Yellow Creek Massacre, this conflict begins between Virginia settlers and the Native American tribes. And those tribes are primarily the Shawnee and the Mingo here in the Ohio Valley. These tensions had risen over the land disputes, of course, and from these Native American attacks. And this all culminates into the Battle of Point Pleasant. And you can see here, this would be representative of a Shawnee warrior at that point. And of course, this is Lord Dunmore, who was the royal governor of Virginia at that time. And he orders this militia to go and take on the Shawnee in the Ohio Valley. So it occurs on October 10th, 1774, and it's led by Colonel Andrew Lewis, who leads quite a large battalion or militia, a group of militia from Virginia. And the other forces are led by Chief Cornstalk. The battle was hard fought. Both sides had significant casualties. There were, I don't know if you could even call it a win, but in the end, the Native Americans, the Shawnee, retreat. Lord Dunmore's troops follow them up the Scioto River until they get into what's basically Pickaway County, present-day Pickaway County, and it ultimately leads to the Treaty of Camp Charlotte in following this battle. And the Treaty of Camp Charlotte was very simple. It more or less designated that the Ohio River was the boundary between Native Americans and European settlers. The treaty brought a very minor temporary peace to West Virginia, or to Western Virginia during this early period. It laid out terms and conditions that the Shawnee would have to abandon their land south and east of the Ohio River, and there would be no longer attacks to settlers along the Ohio River, traveling down the river. And of course, you know that that's probably not going to happen, but at that point, this ends and pushes out the Shawnee and at least gives a minor reprieve to the settlers that are living here in the valley. So we come here to Wheeling now, and Wheelunk was the name that was basically meant the place of the skull because of purported head or skull found near Wheeling at the mouth of the Muskingum, or I'm sorry, at the mouth of Wheeling Creek. So it has a rich history. It's a rich early history, and for us, I like to call it that it's the capital of the Upper Ohio Valley, which I think it is. It started there. If you're watching the news today, we still look at Wheeling like it's the centerfold for our Upper Ohio Valley region. But it played a key role in this expansion of the country from the late 1760s onward. But one of the most significant features, although it was comparatively small, was, of course, Fort Henry. And I stress that this is only a rendering of Fort Henry, and it's grossly out of scale. Fort Henry was not by any means large. If today, the present site, if you'll look here at Fort Henry, this is the suspension bridge, basically where the Capitol Music Hall is to the south of it, just a small piece. That's roughly the area where Fort Henry was constructed. Some, according to historians, Richard Klein, he claims that the site there couldn't have held anything bigger than an 85 by 50 foot structure. but by all accounts, it was even smaller than that. You have to think that, when you hear the word fort, you're thinking of this massive structure that everyone could live in. But in reality, in Wheeling, the fort was strictly for an attack. These settlers would expand out away from it, and they had homes on the island. They had cabins all around this. So anytime there would be the threat of an attack, everyone would abandon their home and go into the fort. So these forts were not huge, and Fort Henry was no exception. But it was originally built in 1774 as Fort Fincastle, which was under British control at that point. But when this war breaks out, the American Revolution's happening, our colonists revolt, and Patrick Henry at that point is a very good orator and one of the early founding fathers of our country. So they named Fort Henry in his honor. And this is constructed primarily by Colonel William Crawford, who was George Washington's friend, and some other locals, but it's located today around where present-day 10th and Main Streets is going to meet. Nicholas Creswell, who was he journaled, and I like to emphasize that there's not a lot of written history. There's a lot of history that was written after the fact, but it was 50 or 60 years after the events that unfolded at Fort Henry in those early 1770 happenings. A lot of these were done 50 years on. So the written history that we have of Fort Henry from actual people that were there is very small. But Nicholas Creswell was one who wrote in his diary, he got to Wheeling Creek, Fort Fincastle on the east side of the river. This is a quadrangular picketed fort on a little hill beside the river, built last summer by Lord Dunmore, a small garrison in it. Here we took into our captain, George Clark, lashed our canoes together and drifted all night, stopped at Grave Creek about 2 a.m. So we know that this was of no significance. Fort Henry was not a significant fort in terms of size, but in the center, you can see here, turn that off. Each on the four corners would be garrisons that could protect, and the upper floor basically had an overhang, and you could pull the slots out, and if anyone was below trying to invade, you could shoot through that to hit them. But also in the middle of this was a captain's quarters that was in the center of the fort, and on top of that, they modified it and they held a swivel cannon, and that swivel cannon proved very valuable in a short amount of time. But it was strategically located in this position for multiple reasons. If you've been down this street, which is now Main Street in Wheeling, it's a pretty large bluff that overlooks the river. And at that point, this was a pretty steep hill that went this way, and they cleared out all the trees and everything to the east, to the south, and then over here was the riverbank. So they were protected on three sides from virtually any attack. And every attack that did happen came from the north due to the hillside that was up against what basically is the north end of Wheeling, or the east side of Wheeling. So it was strategically located there, and it helped maintain, of course, the safety of the residents that were in this region. Which leads into the first siege at Fort Henry in 1777. So in September, a group of about 200 to 300 natives, which were mainly Wyandotte and Mingo, they group up under Wyandot Chief Dunquat, and they approached this fort. Inside the fort is defended by nearly 42 to 100, roughly, militia members, and they're joined by locals and anybody. So they sound off the cannon. When they let the cannon go and they let that blast go, that was the signal that everyone needed to get to the fort, that there was an impending attack. So the battle ensues, and these Indians begin attacking from the north side and the east side, but they don't get too far. It's the battle kills 4 men that were leaving the fort. They attacked them. I'm sorry, they killed 1. They attacked 4 men, but they killed 1. So it's not a huge attack, but it was one of the largest that's there. Captain Mason, who was one of the early militia, he attempted to search for the Indians that had launched this attack, and he ends up retreating because of an ambush, but it also, he calls for help from a man named Captain Van Sweringen, and of course, Major Samuel McCulloch, who we'll talk about here in a second. And if you've been through Wheeling, you've heard of McCulloch's Leap. And it's one of those folklore events that we really don't have written evidence of. It's one of those things where it's a story that's endured nonetheless, but we're not sure what happened other than we know that Major Samuel McCulloch survived it. But he was en route from, he was coming north to south from Fort Van Meter, and he was bringing some guys with him to back up the fort to try to fend off this attack. But along the way, he gets separated from his group, and he encounters a number of Indians that force him up to the top of Wheeling Hill. And when he gets there, he realizes he's surrounded. He's got Native Americans all around him. He has no place to go, and he knows if he's captured, he's going to meet a very nasty end. They're not going to be, because of his reputation preceding him, he knows that he has to do something. So he leaps. He takes his horse and guns it right over the hillside. And this picture's, again, these are images that are way out of perspective. That hillside was not like that. It was much more gradient. But nonetheless, he jumps. And he slides and scrambles all the way down to what is now Wheeling Creek down here. And his chasers, who are standing at the top of the hill, run to the edge of it to look, because they're thinking they're going to find him dead laying down at the bottom of it. But what they see is him actually dashing off across the creek and getting away, and they're stunned. And they aren't even mad about it, really, from all reports. They find that his daring escape is something that led to his daring escape is something worthy of them trying to basically replicate. They want that same type of courage and cunning awareness that he could just jump and get out of there, and they survived it to get away from him. So they keep that in mind, but they're not done with him, and eventually they do get to him down the road. Another interesting event that happened was the Foreman Massacre, which occurred in 1777. So some of the settlers were out and about at Wheeling at Fort Henry, and they see smoke coming from the south. They're looking downriver, and they're seeing sort of in the McMecken area, smoke rising, or they think it's hazy, and they're not really sure if it's smoke, is it haze, is it humidity, what is it? So Captain Foreman, who was based in Wheeling at the fort, he and 45 men are dispatched by Colonel David Shepard, and they're told to go investigate this area. So they go down in that region. They really don't find anything. They don't see anything. And they ultimately, after a day spending the night down there, they decide they're going to come back. En route to McMecken the day before, Native Americans, basically a group of Mingo who were large in number, they see them passing through the area, but they don't attack. They let them go down there, but they plan in their head what they're going to do upon their return. So if you've been to McMecken, this is the north or the south end of McMecken, and this is where the Narrows begin, across from Shady Side. And Captain Foreman is warned by one of the fellow men that we need to go on top of the hill because this is very narrow through here, and this would be the perfect place for an ambush. Foreman is pretty stubborn. He doesn't believe, because on the way down they didn't feel that they had seen anything that would lead them to believe that this is going to be any type of an ambush setup or anything like that. So he proceeds from approaching through the Narrows. He proceeds through it back toward Wheeling, back toward the south end of McMecken. A group of a few guys, I think 3 or 4, maybe 5, they decide to take the higher ridge line, and they were determined to come down around this area here after they cleared this very narrow area. So on approach, the Foreman party are walking, and they start seeing like pieces of silver and jewelry and different things that catches their attention. An obvious sign that there's going to be an ambush, but they didn't pick up on that sign. And the minute those men approach it and start picking it up, all hell breaks loose. Mingos ambush them from every direction. They're ahead of them, they're behind them, they're in these hills. There's no place to go. Some of these men scramble up the hill, but ultimately 27 of these men end up being killed on the spot. A gentleman named Kinsey Dickerson, who happened to be my 5th great-grandfather, was among this group. And I wouldn't be here today if he would have been among the dead, because he was young enough. I think he was in his teens. He sprinted up over this hill and got in behind a log or some trees and laid there until everything disappeared. So I'm here now, 5 generations later, because he survived that incident, which is I always go through there and I think of that. And if you have been through there, you can see that this hillside would just be the prime area because of the size of it and just how narrow it really is. And I'll just throw a quick factoid. I think it was in this area. A day or so later, they just dispatch from Wheeling come down after the survivors make it back to Wheeling. They decide to let it cool down. They don't want to go back into that area for fear of another attack. So they go back and they find all the dead, and they ended up burying most of them along the river in McMecken, somewhere in this area, in a mass grave. And when the highways were being built and development was happening, they did find these graves and ended up moving them. I think it's to Mount Rose Cemetery in Moundsville, but I think there's a marker and a list of the names of the people that were buried and reinterred at Moundsville. So another key incident that happened is the murder of Chief Cornstalk. He was a Shawnee leader and played a very key role in the Lord Dunmore's War, and it sparked conflicts over lands and even into Kentucky. The defeat of the Native American forces at that time also played into how Cornstalk reacted. But he aimed for Shawnee neutrality, but he faced internal divisions. He had his own people, his own Native Americans in there that wanted to keep fighting. He was trying to keep the peace, but ultimately he knew this couldn't probably happen. So in 1777, he's trying to seek peace, but he becomes a hostage to prevent his tribe from siding with the British. So he more or less sacrifices himself to this. He was very known for his military genius, his oratory skills. He was well treated. He was well treated by our settlers at that point. But eventually, this group of militia stormed the cabin that he's staying in down at Fort Randolph in present-day Point Pleasant, and they kill him for revenge, for basically the revenge of an American militiaman who had been killed. So this constitutes another act of violence that won't go forgotten by the Native Americans that are in the region, and it just continues to perpetuate these tensions. So you can see how dangerous a place this area was, but also, what they were fighting for. One side's fighting for territorial control, the other side is fighting for what used to be their homeland. So we lead up into the second siege of Fort Henry, which over the period of the course of the fort being there were at least 4 attacks that were documented, but the first siege in 1777 and this siege in 1782 are the 2 primary ones. So in September 11th, 1782, that's a dark day in Wheeling. It's also a dark day in our country's history. This large group of Native Americans, about 150 to 300 Wyandotte, Shawnee, Seneca, and Delaware. It's a large contingent. They are led by Simon Girty, who was known as Dirty Girty back then. He was actually captured at the age of 15 by the Shawnee in 1756, and he watched his stepdad be brutally massacred and other people. And even in spite of that, he still changes and gets adopted by the natives because of this. He's captured. And it wasn't uncommon for them to capture children and basically convert them over to being Native American. So he converts to Native American. He starts practicing and living their way of life, and he gets exchanged to the British in 1764. But he and his brother decided that, hey, we were free, we're teenagers, we could run the hills, we could do all this stuff. So conformity back to the British and colonial, lifestyle was not for them at that point because they'd been so ingratiated into the Native American way of life. They decide to return to these tribes, and he becomes a British interpreter. But he became also a ruthless and very highly skilled woodsman, and he develops a very dark history around him that precedes him to this day. Simon Girty is joined by about 50 of Butler's Rangers under the command of a British captain named Pratt, and they launched the siege on Fort Henry. But the British Rangers, as they're approaching, they hear the guns, they hear the swivel cannon fire. All the settlers in Wheeling hurry up and quickly abandon their cabins. They go to the fort. They're inside there, but we don't know the number of people, but we know it wasn't a large amount of settlers, and neither do the British. The British and the Native Americans don't know how many people they're up against, but the battle begins. So the British Rangers, they get ready to march toward the gates, and they're holding the Union flag, and they're approaching the east gate. And the swivel cannon is pointed right at them, and it's fired, and the flag goes down, and those guys retreat, and it's quickly apparent to the British that this is going to be no easy task. They're not going to give it up. That was the first signal that the settlers that were hunkering down inside of this fort. They're not giving it up easy. They're going to have to take them and kill them. So Colonel David Shepard, who is inside the fort, he's directing the defense. He has less than 30 men. By most accounts, there's less than 30 men protecting dozens of women and children in the fort. So in order to make themselves look bigger, and because, of course, when these walls are 8 to 9 feet high, logs basically put side by side, you can't see into the fort, you can only hear what's going on. So those settlers that are inside, they start making noise. They're clacking pots and pans, they're firing rifles, they're throwing hats in the air. They're trying to make the Native Americans and this entourage that's there to attack them think that there's more people inside of there than there really is, to try to discourage this attack. So Gertie and Pratt, they again demand the surrender. David Shepard refuses outright and vows, you're going to have to kill all of us if you're going to take it. So the first day of the siege, the British are attacking from the north and the east sides, and their goal was to just besiege it and try to get to the inside and destroy the fort. But the cannon proves pretty effective at keeping them at bay, because at that point, the only protection that the British and the Native Americans have are along this hillside that's wooded, because all this area below the fort and north of it had been cleared out and was made into basically farmland. So there's nothing to protect anybody that's approaching the fort from the open gunfire. So one of the big stories that emerges from, in Wheeling folklore history, but it's really not folklore, it actually happened, or at least, we know it's something happened. Low gunpowder results within the fort. So they've been holding off this attack, and they're realizing, hey, we have no more gunpowder in here. What are we going to do? So they come up with a plan, and a young Betty Zane, who you can see here, is 16 years old, and she decides that, well, I'm a woman, maybe they won't fire at me, maybe they won't do, maybe they won't suspect what I'm doing. So at about 12 noon, she opens the front gate of the fort and proceeds to head down to Ebenezer Zane's cabin, which there's speculation about where it actually was. Some say it was to the southeast, some say it was more this direction, but what we do know is that the fort, it was between the fort and the enemy, and she was walking to it. And it was about 50 yards away, wherever it was, but for the sake of what I've read, I put it to the southeast because I think generally that's where it probably was located. So she proceeds across what would be the battlefield. Not a shot fired. The Native Americans and the British Rangers are somewhat shocked to see such a young girl walking, and they're not sure why. So she goes into at that point, the house or the cabin, and they begin to load her apron with about, several things of black powder. When she steps out, she makes a little bit of a dash, and they quickly realize, hey, she's carrying something. So under a hail of gunfire, the Native Americans and the attackers realize what she has, and they're trying to take her out. But she successfully makes that 50-yard dash back to the gate inside and saves the day for the settlers. So on that next morning, the British are left with Patriot John Boggs, Captain John Boggs arrives with about 70 soldiers. And as they approach, the British begin to retreat. They already know that at this point they've lost. They can't get past the swivel gun. There's no way to really get close enough to it to attack. So they, for once and for all, they give up. So at this point, the second siege of Fort Henry becomes what some people call the last battle of the American Revolution. I think that's probably more sentimental because General Cornwallis had already surrendered at Yorktown 11 months earlier. But I guess you could say that this would be the last conflict between settlers and the British, at least during the Revolutionary War period. So in total, there were 4 attacks that happened on Fort Henry, but this one being the last one, and it begins the new chapter for Wheeling and its expansion. So one of the things that settlers also had to face was these ambushes, like we've seen on the former party that I discussed, on the Foreman party, and you also had abductions. There are numerous written histories about Native Americans taking women, children, and men, some being killed, some being incorporated into their tribes and used, but some also being used as bargaining chips. But one of these happened with Martin Wetzel, who was a friend or the brother of Lewis Wetzel, who was a notorious Indian killer. he's taken about 20 miles that he supposed, and this is from Hal's History of Ohio, up Sunfish Creek. And he says that, and goes on and says, they stopped under a large ledge of rocks and left a guard with him about an hour. And if you read into this and you look on the map and you kind of calculate where they were, it's basically present day Piatt Park in Monroe County. These large overhangs, and he detailed how these rocks were, the Native Americans would lift them up and bury lead and other things underneath them and place the rocks back so they couldn't be found by anybody passing through. But he observed all these different things that they did and found that, he eventually was able to escape and get away from there. But he took all that back to Wheeling and to where he was staying at to tell them, hey, there's still groups out there, and we all still have to be careful about this because some of these people did not make it back, unfortunately, and some of them got incorporated into the tribes. One of these skirmishes that happened along Sunfish Creek, which is about 28 miles south of Clarington, has a very interesting tale. Again, there's no real evidence of this other than written oral histories of people passing it down, but there are a couple, like in this one, Hal's History of Ohio, is the story of the Big Indian. And it says that a group of, in 2 canoes, a group of dispatch militia were coming down the river along the Ohio shore, and they spot a white settler along the bank of Sunfish Creek at the mouth of Sunfish Creek emptying into the Ohio. And as they're approaching, they're going to pick him up thinking he's escaped, he's gotten away, they're going to go and rescue this guy. But as they're approaching, one of the men in the canoe spot a very large Indian poking his head around from this large tree, and he quickly pulls up his rifle and shoots this Native American in the head, instantly killing him, of course. And of course, the other Native Americans that are there, they let up a large war cry. They yip and hoop, and they go and they take this poor decoy at this point, the other settler that they had used as a decoy along the creek. They take him, and he disappears, and he's never found. So I'm sure it was an eye for an eye. If they lost a Native American, this guy probably was taken back and burned at the stake and probably met a very untimely demise. But years later, Chester Bishop is digging his basement in Clarington, Ohio, along the river, and they come across the bones of a very large Indian that they claim to be 8 feet 5 inches. So it substantiates that this possibly happened, but nobody knows where the skeleton ended up. Some think that the Ohio History Connection has it somewhere in their archives, but won't let it out. Others think it might have just been reinterred somewhere in Clarington along the riverbank, or maybe in one of our cemeteries in an unmarked grave. But it's still a story that persists today of continued skirmishes that happened here along the river. So we continue downriver to present-day Marietta, and that's where the Northwest Ordinance really takes shape in 1787. And this legislation established a piece of framework basically for governing and settling the Northwest Territory, which included present-day Ohio and 4 other states. And this gentleman you see here is Manasseh Cutler. He played a large role in that, and he was also, I believe, the founding president of Ohio University in Athens. So the ordinance divided the territory basically into small regions. These men were from New England, but they also had connections to the founding fathers, and they wanted to see its own system of government setting up a precedent that other organization and the admission of states could potentially use as the country expanded. And among them, with Manasseh Cutler, was Rufus Putnam, who, if you've been to Marietta, there's Putnam Street. His cabin that's inside Campus Martius is still there. So you have some very academically minded people that are well aware of what they want to see and what they want to leave as their legacy in this region. Part of the Northwest Ordinance also guaranteed civil liberties, religious freedom, and property rights, which was for the territory, which was it was a progressive step for these Americans and settlers that were here following the end of the Revolutionary War. But probably the most interesting thing that was in it at the time period, and probably the most controversial, was that it prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory, making it a landmark decision, more or less, by these men that the whole abolition of slavery in the United States would eventually come based off this document. But this document was the first to say we're not going to be a slave-holding territory or state, which in the end was the right decision, of course, but it was very forward-thinking of them to do that and almost unheard of. There was a lot of questioning of that, but a lot of these men were religious and felt that this was a necessary first step into making a more perfect place to live and grow. So this is a very neat photo that I've incorporated, and it's called The Landing of the Original 48 Settlers in Marietta, and they're led by Rufus Putnam, which is right here, our friend Rufus Putnam. This would be basically the parking lot of the Lafayette Hotel, and this would be Fort Harmer or Harmer, the village of Harmer across the river, the Muskingum River from Marietta. So they established this as the first permanent settlement here in the Northwest Territory in 1787. And this painting, while, neat, it's inaccurate, but it still conveys the image of what we wanted, what Saul of Bosworth, who was a painter, wanted to convey, that this singular moment began what would be the expansion of the country based in Marietta from the Northwest Territory onward. This painting recently sold for many thousands of dollars. It's allegedly going to be put on display in Marietta, probably one of the museums. We don't know when. We actually don't know who has it, but it originally was in the president's house at Marietta University or Marietta College. The Putnam family had it sold at auction, and someone locally must have bought it because it did allegedly make its way back to Marietta, and we're waiting for some reveal at some point, but we're happy to see that it did stay there, because when we heard that this painting was going up for sale, we weren't sure where it would end up, but it does commemorate a very important part of our region's history. So this image basically embodies the spirit of westward migration and was the starting point for many who ventured onward into the frontier. There was a military fort that was there, Marietta, Fort Harmer, that was built across there. And that symbolized the region's strategic importance as well, because you had to have these outposts that you could really take care of yourself if no one could get dispatched to back you up if you got into a situation where you were under attack. So these forts up and down the river, particularly this one, which ended up being a major fort, unlike what Fort Henry would be considered a minor fort, it's really symbolized this region's strategic importance. And of course, it laid the groundwork for the Northwest Ordinance, and the political and economic influence for this region cannot be understated, because these men all had ties to our founding fathers, and they really played a role in the development and governance of the Northwest Territory. So I always like to throw in the neat Wheeling's Lewis and Clark connection. And Meriwether Lewis was a leader of the Corps of Discovery, and he embarked on this historic journey down the Ohio River from Pittsburgh in the fall of 1803. Several, 20-some years ago, if you recall, I think they stopped in Wheeling. They did like a reenactment and came down, did the full journey, reenacting everything. And one of the stops in Wheeling was similar to his stop when he came down. And his reason for there was because he'd been fighting with a gentleman that was building his boats for this exploration in Pittsburgh, and the gentleman was constantly drunk, constantly giving him lip service. It'll be done next week. We'll get it to you. And Lewis has had enough, and he says, I'm going. He gets his boats from Pittsburgh, and he starts down the river. And he notes, I have been compelled to purchase a pirogue at this place in order to transport the baggage which was sent by land from Pittsburgh, and also to lighten the boat as much as possible. On many bars, the water in the deepest part does not exceed 6 inches. So again, this is a natural flowing river, and he's had it. He wants to get this exploration underway, and he stops in Wheeling. So Wheeling to the rescue. He gets what he needs from there. He begins his journey down with everything loaded, and he meets, in October of 1803, he meets his co-commander, William Clark, at the Falls of the Ohio at present-day Louisville, Kentucky. So this marks a significant moment in our history, as it brought together these two very good leaders and explorers who would eventually explore and map the newly acquired Louisiana Purchase, or the Louisiana Territory, which was done under right around that period, right before that. So their whole goal was to find what this country looks like, what the expansion is going to end up being, and how best that they can go about to get out there. So their leadership would have a profound impact, of course, on our nation's westward expansion, and it really helped fulfill Thomas Jefferson's vision that he explore and settle the western frontier, shaping the future of the country. But we can't underestimate the role that whaling played in all this, especially because of the Ohio River, and probably, the Ohio River was our nation's really first major highway, but a real highway, national road, comes to Wheeling and has profound significance for many reasons. Number one, it's a gateway to the West. At this point, it's your beginning of your journey westward. You're connecting the eastern seaboard from Maryland all the way over to Wheeling, where the road terminates. And at that point, the road terminated right at the bottom side of the suspension bridge. But that bridge and that road is what really began a nation's crucial expansion, because you could get so many people and supplies across it, and it was very strategic. Even outside of Pittsburgh was a starting point on the river, but if you were going westward, you would eventually find Wheeling to be your spot where you were going to really get all the supplies that you needed and move on. So there was an economic and social impact to having National Road terminating right at the center of this trade and industry and commerce. So it facilitated western migration. It's fostered a settlement in the Ohio Valley, and it played a crucial role in supplementing everything relating to economical and social development here in the region, particularly. But it also played a key factor in slavery, because if you were enslaved, this side of the Ohio River, you were in Virginia, slavery existed. But if you were able to get to the other side of the river, which would be the Northwest Territory, slavery did not exist. It was prohibited. So the impact that this road had on slavery can't be understated either, because it was an escape route. Both the river and the road played a part in the Underground Railroad, particularly relating to their journey, especially if they were escaping and trying to get north. Both were used to get them even further out of the region. So the presence of National Road also encouraged the migration of free and enslaved African Americans to the Ohio Valley, but a lot of them were just passing through. They wanted to go further north and get out of as far away as they could from Virginia if they needed to, because obviously Wheeling was still a slave-holding area, and slaves were often sold at Market Street, on Market Street, and then sent right down here to the wharf to be loaded on steamboats to be taken south. And I always think to myself, if you were one of those slaves and you were on that steamboat, and if you were in a position on there where you could look out, it'd probably be pretty. Number one, it's disheartening, the fact that you're a slave, but it would be really disheartening to look out and see that this side of the river was slavery and this side of the river was freedom, but you were 50 yards, 20 yards away from freedom, but you couldn't reach it. So this combination of the Ohio River and transportation networks like National Road, they contributed to the Ohio Valley's significance in the larger struggle against slavery as well. One of the big factors on the Ohio River that helped expand this country was flatboats. And these boats were built fairly large for the period, but they had a dual purpose. You could pack everything you owned on this boat. You had nice lumber. And when you got to your destination downriver, you could take this boat, haul it to the shoreline, or tear it apart piece by piece, and you could build yourself a fairly respectable home, at least to get you, get started. But from the 1800s and the early 1900s, these flatboats, at that period, these flatboats gave way to what we know as shanty boats into the early 1900s. So they've all enabled settlers and people of all race and creed to go up and down the river if they needed to. But these simple flat bottom boats were easily constructed for transportation of goods, and they did that. However, the emergence of steamboats in the 19th century really took off. And one of those key moments that steamboats weren't created in Wheeling, but the one that led the way for every steamboat going forward in its design, with a flat bottom hull and a stern wheel, was the steamer Washington. It was designed in Wheeling by Captain Henry M. Shreve, and most of these boats at the period when these steamboats started around 1811, they were built much like an ocean-going vessel. They had deep hulls, and the problem with that was the river. You would be fine if you were in the fall or the spring when the river was high from either heavy rains or upriver from storms and things. So that was great. But in the summertime, this river would drop pretty low, and these boats had to find a way to navigate. So Captain Henry Shreve comes up with the idea that I'm going to put the boilers near the front of the boat. I'm going to put the engine in the back and the wheel above the hull and make a flat hull boat, and that these boats could go in water a foot or a little over a foot deep without any issue. So his creation of this steamboat, Washington, in 1816, it's a significant development, not just for Wheeling, but for the country, because it served as the prototype for every Western-style stern wheel riverboat thereafter. And what that does is basically explodes the country's expansion. Once this boat runs and they know that it's successful, other boats start coming on. Then you go from flat boats that are moving at a very glacial pace to steamboats that can move 7, 8, 9 miles per hour. They can carry passengers and freight. The country's growth explodes because of these steamboats. And the Ohio River, Wheeling, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati all play a crucial role. This Upper Ohio Valley region really plays that crucial role. And Henry M. Shreve today, you don't hear much about him for everything that he did in Wheeling and the design that he had. There's really not much out there that recognizes him, but Shreveport, Louisiana is named for him. And just as a factoid, the current Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, he attended Captain Shreve High School in Shreveport, Louisiana, which is named after Captain Henry M. Shreve of Wheeling. So the end of the end of the exploration really becomes the part where this country is expanding to the point where civilization is giving way. It's no longer a wilderness river; it's an expanding country. The wilderness river gives way to a highway. And when you think about all the people that began that, you start with Robert Cavalier, and then Celeron, Washington, Clark, and Lewis. These men were truly the people that, not all of them. This is an abbreviated version of history here. Believe me when I say that there's a lot of history that's buried in this that you have to boil down into these 29 slides. But these early explorations that were pivotal in shaping the Ohio Valley's development, and it was a critical launching point for the western expansion of our country. They asserted these territorial claims. They established trade posts. All this, everything that happened in the country is expansion. You can look at this region and see the role that it played. And unfortunately, we don't have any museums in this area that really highlight all the things that happened here in this way. I'd love to see that happen at some point because it's history that I don't think that most people realize just the role we played. We often feel like this is flyover country today. The country often overlooks us. We're Appalachians. They don't want to, we don't see a lot of happenings here, but things did happen here at one point, and they were great things that happened, and they were ugly things that happened, but they also contributed to this country's growth. And we all live here today. We have to think of this area and the role that it played, the legacy that it had, and be proud of that because it happened here. We contributed to this country's growth, and Wheeling was a large part of that, and the Ohio River was a major role in that. So we look at this valley's history, we look at the exploration, the colonization, the violence, the growth. It's all a microcosm of how this country expanded and all the conflicts that occurred in between. So it was a turbulent period, but it shaped our geographic, our economic, and our cultural landscape of the nation. And it's left, in my mind, a very complex legacy that continues to be studied and one that's debated today. So, like I said, this was an abbreviated history, and there are numbers of books out there. If anyone has any, would like a recommendation, please let me know. But it truly is a fascinating history that I feel that we just don't give it its due credit. So, any questions? Any questions? Yes, sir.
I've heard that there was an Indian mound in the middle of the Bel-Air Village Park at one time.
Yeah, I don't know if that's actual fact or not. There's a book, there's one. to locate them. So at that point, when I'm looking at it, like one was at New Martinsville where the wharf landing is. That one was actually in the Ohio River, but when new dams were built and the river raised, it's completely submerged. It's probably gone now. You can look at these maps from 1910, 1911, whatever it was that he was drawing, and he's got these little triangular red triangles symbolizing either a mound or an actual barrier. But if you go to those areas, you try to look for them. I've done it. One is actually near my parents' property. I think we found it. I sent pictures to a local archaeologist that works at Great Creek Mound and another one from Northern Ohio, and they both agreed that they think that's what it is. I think they're going to look at it further to examine it in person rather than, instead of just looking at my pictures. But, development, these things got destroyed. So I can't swear to it, but it would not surprise me in the least bit that there's probably a mound here. They were found up and down the river. Any other questions? I've heard people say, like at Fort Henry, they'd like to see like a replica of Fort Henry get built, but I think they'd be very disappointed once it was built to see if they did go by the what we do have, what evidence. It would definitely not be, I think, what most people think of as a fort. But there have been digs around those businesses. They haven't found anything conclusive other than pieces of flatware or china or transferware from the late 18th century. So it tracks that is probably from the settlers that were there, but there's really there's no footprint left of where Fort Henry was. And by the time really the second attack occurred in 1782, it had fallen in disrepair. So they were actively defending it while nailing anything they could up to support these. One wall even collapsed during the attack, and they had to quickly rush and fix it. So it wasn't by any means a major fort. But I always go through there and think, I'd love for them to do an archaeological dig, but I know that there's just been so much development over the last 200 years that there's just nothing there to be found, I'm sure. So, any other questions? Or I appreciate your time, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you much. Very interesting. To follow up on that question about a mound in Bel Air, it wouldn't have been a very big one, but during the conflict over the ownership of the park, there was testimony that was rendered before the court that the park had a mound of some size, not huge, but there was a mound there, and that it was knocked down for attention. In other words, they wanted to level the ground, and that's in the testimony that appears in the court case, Sullivan versus the City of Bel Air. And that is upstairs in our library, so if anybody would like to read about that, you can go to the actual testimony. Okay, now everybody have their tickets? Everybody have their tickets? We're gonna do the white one first. The white tickets, why don't you, Taylor, why don't you pull the... Okay, the white ticket ends 503. 503. There we go, okay. You get the door prize. And Taylor, you want to pull the next one? Sure.
This one's for the raffle basket.
This is for the raffle basket.
Thanks.
And that number is 176. 176. 176. There we go. Congratulations, Joe. We want to thank you all for coming to the 2024 Winter Lecture Series. We like to put these programs on free to the public. We tried our best to get interesting speakers, and Taylor, of course, closes out this season. So Next Wednesday, you're probably going to be home cutting grass instead of being here. But thank you all for coming.